Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Schneebaum. I'm an international lawyer and professor of international law here in Washington, and it is my pleasure to host this event and to welcome all of you to it. The topic, of course, is the new face of Saudi Arabia. Has anything changed? Now, I need hardly start from basics with an audience so well versed in the subject, but let me just set some context. The occasion of Mohammed bin Salman's accession to the status of Crown Prince in 2017 was seen around the world as a cause for optimism. There were, as we all know, highly visible reforms undertaken in his accession, long overdue reforms, including, of course, permitting women to drive, permitting women to attend sporting events. And MBS, as he's universally known, himself has presented as a modern man, a man comfortable with and conversant with Western cultures, committed to open dialogue, and resolved to diversify his country's economy and to dismantle some of the more sclerotic aspects of its governance. The topics that we're going to explore today concern whether he has succeeded in doing those things, or whether these appearances actually correspond to reality. Whether they do or do not has, of course, enormous consequences. It has consequences for the security of the region. It has consequences in the first instance for Saudi Arabia's 33 million people, but it has consequences also for global concerns, global stability, not only in the Middle East, but again, more broadly. And as we all know, stability in the Middle East affects us all in many ways. So we're going to address two aspects, two facets of Saudi life today in our panels. The first will concern the Saudi domestic regime and the observance or lack of observance of human rights within that regime. And then the second panel will concern foreign policy, and especially the disastrous war in Lebanon, and Yemen, in Yemen, already described accurately as the worst humanitarian crisis of our times. Now, the first panel, whose title in your programs is "Can There Be Reform Without Rights in Saudi Arabia?" will emphasize questions of human rights and constitutional reform. Is there a real resolve to protect and defend human rights within the kingdom? Will the kingdom achieve even minimum compliance with international norms, binding as matters of both treaty and customary international law, regarding women, regarding religious minorities, and regarding dissenters and detainees? Now, in that connection, I would commend to your attention a report prepared last September entitled "Shrouded in Secrecy: The Human Rights Situation in Saudi Arabia Following Arrests in September 2017, which focuses especially on questions concerning the conditions of detention and the rights of those who get crosswise with the regime. The report was prepared by Lord MacDonald and by Rodney Dixon, Queen's Counsel, British barrister, who is here with us and who will speak at the end of the conference later this afternoon. The second panel will discuss the kingdom's foreign policy, as I said, especially in Yemen, and I meant Yemen, and the US position with respect to that war. The US, of course, has long been allied with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, seeing it as a solid, stabilizing influence in the Middle East, seeing it as a counterweight to the malign presence of Iran and its promotion of terrorist groups around the world. But that, of course, that support poses questions. Is the effort to contain Iran really promoted by the bloodbath that is occurring in Yemen? Is the war in Yemen, like the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, likely in the end to drive more people into the arms of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, as opposed to taking them away from that lure. And what should be the US response? In March, 44 senators voted to cut off arms sales to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That issue has not died. It will come back, and it may come back in a politically different Senate early next year. How can the United States continue to reconcile support for the regime of MBS with its regional goals and with its own broader role in the world as a beacon for certain values that some of us here in this country continue to espouse? Now, let me conclude my opening remarks by reading to you a paragraph from a newspaper column that appeared not long ago. It reads as follows: Saudi Arabia must face the damage from the past 3+ years of war in Yemen. The conflict has soured the kingdom's relations with the international community, affected regional security dynamics, and harmed its reputation in the Islamic world. Saudi Arabia is in a unique position to simultaneously keep Iran out of Yemen and to end the war on favorable terms if it changes its role from war maker to peacemaker. Saudi Arabia could use its clout and leverage within Western circles and empower international institutions and mechanisms to resolve the conflict. However, the author concluded, the window for achieving a resolution to the conflict is rapidly closing. That article appeared in the Washington Post Online on September 11th, auspiciously enough. And the author of that article was a man named Jamal Khashoggi. Jamal Khashoggi, as some of you who've seen earlier versions of the program for this event, you may know, was invited to participate and would have been a speaker at today's event here at the Carnegie Endowment. What has happened to Jamal Khashoggi, of course, is not known to any of us. However, what is clear is that if the rumors and the stories that we are hearing coming from Istanbul are proved accurate, then the regime has turned a corner. Then its support in places like Washington and London is very much at risk, very much in play. And we'll see in the coming days, presumably, how that initial drama plays out. But let me simply conclude at this point by saying that Jamal Khashoggi is with us today. He is with us in spirit. We all hope that he is safe. We all fear that he is not. So with that, let me introduce our first speaker, who is Roula Jabrail. Roula is a journalist, having written extensively for such publications as Newsweek. She is a professor at the American University of Rome, I'm proud to say, since that's an old client of mine, and also at the University of Miami. And it is a pleasure to introduce Roula to you. Thanks.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Rod Dickinson, for organizing this timely conference and very important one. And I wish we did it sooner, and I wish we do this kind of conference every time we have allies of the West committing what we view as not normal. I wish we did this when Mohammed bin Salman was committed atrocities in Yemen and starving millions of people. I wish we did that when he was making dissidents disappear at home, cracking down, yet we were silent. Not because we didn't know. We had actual people like Jamal telling us over and again to be aware, to be well informed, not to look at this crown prince words, but to look at his actions. It's heavy for me to talk this morning. It's hard, but we must absolutely keep Jamal's words alive. We don't know where he is, but we know that September last year, Jamal wrote his last column in a Saudi newspaper called Al Watan. And I remember that column very well because my sister sent it to me. And she said, follow this man's work. And he started the column with a title, I am a Saudi, but I disagree. And the word in Arabic were, أنا سعودي ولكن مختلف. And it was incredible to read this column. I knew about Jamal because he was one of the few people who interviewed actually Osama bin Laden. And all of us foreign policy analysts who followed, obviously, the jihadist movement, the Islamist movement, were looking at who were the first people to interview and understand the phenomena better than anybody else. Jamal was one of those. But also he was a royal advisor. He wore many hats. He was a journalist, he was an author. So I knew of his work. And then within days, he was demanded, the government, the Saudi government, banned him from tweeting and from writing and from talking in public. Jamal decided 6 months after that to leave because he understood before anybody else that if he stayed, he would be near all of these people, critics, activists, reformists, who are in jail. He would be arrested. He understood it instinctively. So he left. He came here. And because of his credibility, of his stature, and because of the incredible amount of information he had, the Washington Post hired him as a contributor. We all understood, people who understand the region understood the danger of that. Not only he was an Arab speaking, he understood the royal court from within, he understood the limit of reforms, he also understood how the Saudis managed to manipulate the public opinion for so long. But also he understood something else. In 2011, millions of people went in the streets in the Arab world, demanding what Jamal aspired to live with and by. They demanded democracy, dignity, freedom, and social justice. Jamal lived by those values. And he was inspired by those millions of people. So he started using his words to express his desire for a better Saudi Arabia. He loved his home, loved it dearly. And he said during Oslo Freedom Forum in May this year, I'm doing what I'm doing because I love Saudi Arabia. That's the only home I love, and I want to be in that home. That was his home. He wanted to improve. In a better world, he would be the excellent advisor to the crown prince. If this crown prince was a different man, he would get somebody like Jamal who understood the world, who understood communication and international arena, but also understood the needs and the aspiration of simple people. I met Jamal in April while I was researching for this, the only article and the only cover story about Mohammed bin Salman that was not lavishing him with praise, that was not calling him a reformist, which is a failure of international media to actually look into his actions and not fall behind the PR campaign that was unleashed by Cambridge Analytica and by these millions of dollars thrown into lobbyist group just to clean his image, to clean Mohammed bin Salman image and open a new phase for Saudi relationship with the West, a phase that was post 9/11. The Saudi wanted to pivot from the image of the country that produced the 15 of the 19 hijackers. And in that attempt to pivot, it was cosmetic reforms that they engaged in. So I met Jamal, we talked for hours, and I recorded, and I still listen to his voice. Last night before coming here, I listened to his words, and his words exactly can tell you, it traces a path for all of us that can open our eyes to understanding not only Saudi Arabia, but the regionally dynamic, and especially this sick relationship of this, that the Saudi have with the West. You know, when President Trump was elected, everybody was tweeting, "This is not normal." And I went and researched this sentence. Where did it come from? Actually, this sentence was born in the dark corner of the web to describe the consequences of meth addiction. What happened to Jamal, if it's true that he was lured into the embassy, the consulate in Istanbul, and according to the Turkish, he was dismembered inside and cut in pieces and put in boxes and basically taken out from the embassy. If that is what really happened, and we will know sooner or later because evidence of what happened exists, and that's why we need to demand an investigation. If this is what's happened, this is not normal even by Saudi standard. This is a new level. This can tells you one thing, that this crown prince is Gaddafi on steroid. We have a new mad dog in the Middle East, and his name is Mohammed bin Salman. And we need to hold this man accountable. If this crime committed in a consulate on foreign soil against a US resident, a columnist for the Washington Post, I know from sources that Mohammed bin Salman was angry that Jamal was giving this respect and this international platform. He was angry and he was outraged by the fact that the Washington Post chose, not only Jamal, but chose to publish in Arabic. I just want to remind you that months ago, I believe 6 or 7 weeks ago, Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi government were outraged that the foreign minister of Canada tweeting or retweeted a tweet in Arabic demanding the release of an activist. They cut relationship with Canada. They demanded apologies. They even went as far as demanding that all their students go back. If they can't do that because of one tweet, imagine their outrage, and his especially outraged, Mohammed bin Salman, that a Saudi citizen, that he doesn't consider citizen, by the way, his citizens are slaves. This is how they treat them. They consider subjects that they can do whatever they want with their lives. They can arrest them, they can torture them, they can take their wealth at any time. This is not citizenry. This is not the relationship of a government that serves its people. This is his idea that the people serve the ruler. This is a backward idea that needs to be demolished. Anyone that is willing to cross those kind of lines, shatter those kind of norms and rules, is a cause of instability, not only for the Saudis, for the world. I think today, for the first time, after a month of despair of reading these glossy articles about how Mohammed bin Salman is the new reformer, while we knew people who really understood Middle East politics and Middle East, and especially Saudi politics, when I think Tom Friedman wrote an article saying it's a Saudi Arab Spring, I almost choked on my own porridge in the morning because I thought, this is a guy actually who paid to abort the Arab Spring. He was a counter-revolutionary who murdered the Arab Spring. It's an insult to the million of people who stood everywhere demanding nothing, demanding what Jamal actually wanted, more pluralism, not to criminalize and demonize activists, journalists, critics, but allow them to speak, which is a cornerstone of any democracy. It's your right to dissent, to disagree, to speak. Let's hold this regime into account by demanding from our governments a fair investigation, an independent one, the truth. Jamal wanted always to tell the truth, even if that truth would cost him his life. He was aware. When I asked him in my interview with him if he feared for his life, he said something that many activists in the Middle East told me. He said, either you cease, if you're a critic, an activist, a journalist, either you cease to be in the Middle East or you cease to speak, and I want my voice to stay alive. If the murderers and the barbaric people who killed him And the rumors and the account of the Turkish police that 15 people, look, there was 15 of the 19 hijackers, and if they send 15 people to kill Salman, the irony of numbers and history. We must demand that our government stop selling weapons and ban selling weapons to the Saudi regime, that they start seizing their assets, and they start demanding that these people who ordered the murder, not only the people who executed it, be banned from the international community and branded as war criminals, because this is what they are. I understand that sometimes we have to have an uncomfortable conversation in the West about our allies. If the Iranian regime, imagine if the Iranians did such thing. Imagine the uproar. Imagine what Congress would have been doing now, today, yesterday. Can we hold our allies to the same standard? If you really care about human rights violation only when the enemy commits them, then you really don't care about human rights violation. It's time that we understand that this kind of instability is what radicalized people, is what brought to us 9/11 and extremism. This is the kind of instability, and the regime in Saudi Arabia is capable of exporting 3-4 things. One of them is instability and radicalization, extremism. If our relationship with Saudi Arabia of somebody who is like an addict to meth, then this relationship is not normal. It's not what the Saudi regime is doing. It's what our governments are doing here in the West. We are too addicted to their lobbyist money, to their the fact that they are buying hardware, military weapons. This is our addiction, because addiction is getting people be killed, disappeared, murdered, and this addiction is allowing this regime to get away with that. Time to demand a different approach. Our life depends on it. Our friends' life depends on it. But above all, future generation will look back at this moment in history where we have all this information, and they will judge us unkindly, and they will be horrified, because if we did not act and would not pressure our government to act, then we are simply complicit. And I refuse today to be complicit. We will continue to speak, and whatever happens to Jamal, wherever he is in the universe, he will live, and his word will outlive his murderous people. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that really powerful commentary, Rula, and thanks everyone for being here and for organizing the conference. My name is Akbar Shahid Ahmed. I'm a foreign affairs reporter with the Huffington Post, based here in DC since 2014 and writing on issues around the Muslim majority world. I'm here for this panel on the domestic situation inside Saudi Arabia with some great speakers. I've got Basma Momani, who is a professor at the University of Waterloo and a senior fellow at the Stimson Center here in DC. Mason Hubbard, an attorney in private practice who works on investigations and public international law, will be looking at the legal aspect here. And Abdullah Al-Oda, a senior fellow at Georgetown University, working on Muslim-Christian understanding. So thanks all for being here. Thinking a lot about Jamal, as everyone is. It's been a week since we last heard from Jamal, since he went into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And something I keep thinking about is how he repeatedly described himself as not a dissident. He described himself as a patriot, always, and said, this is my home, this is what I want to work on, this is what I want to really benefit. It takes me back to kind of the Saudi-Canada rift, which we had some interactions on Twitter around. And at that time, a former intelligence source said to me, Saudi Arabia is shifting the goalposts. What they're doing is, who is a dissident, who is out of lines, who is vulnerable, has now changed. And that's how someone like Jamal Khashoggi, a consummate insider, suddenly can disappear with allegations that Saudi authorities have him. What that's meant over the last year is a campaign of arrests that's targeted clerics and business people last year, scores of them, many of whom later said they were subject to torture, beatings inside a very, very classy hotel in Riyadh that I'm sure many US officials and lobbyists have stayed at. And over the last 5 months, that's led to a wave of arrests of women's rights activists, which has been really remarkable given that the big story of this year was supposed to be Saudi Arabia was finally letting women get licenses to drive. Huge in the year 2018. Instead, what the kingdom did was arrest Hatun al-Fassi in June. They arrested Samar Badawi in July. They've arrested Loujain Hathloul. They've intimidated other activists abroad. And the through line through all of this has been a real determination on the part of the Saudi leadership, in my view, my analysis, just to say, no Saudi really matters. Mm-hmm. It's a real attack on the dignity of any Saudi citizen. And there are 20 million of them, many of them highly educated, highly competent, really great representatives of their societies. And we've interacted with activists and academics from Saudi Arabia. What we've seen is that no Saudi is beyond the reach of the Saudi state's distrust of its population. Covering US-Saudi relations over the last few years has really made me think about how it's done at a totally high level. It's it's crown prince to Jared Kushner, another kind of crown prince. It's lobbyist to lobbyist. It's not population to population. It hasn't been historically, especially with the US. And if anything, the US population is quite distrustful of Saudi Arabia as a partner, and anti-Americanism in Saudi Arabia, if you look at any polls, is actually strikingly high. Is there a way to engage those societies and build these relationships better without threatening the Saudi leadership is, I think, a question that I'd really love to talk to all of you about. It takes me back to sort of Hala al-Dosri, one of the most amazing Saudis I've ever spoken to, a great activist, academic, and just a really serious person who said to me earlier this year, the thing about misogyny, the thing about the guardianship system and why the kingdom is so cracking down on women, is sustaining these really patriarchal structures while it's allowing them to drive, is that the hierarchy needs to be sustained at every level of society. In the home, in the family unit, outside that. And Hala's point was, if men and women are equal, if anyone is equal, how can you justify one having extra privileges? And I think it's a really important question as we look at Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman came to be now. What does it mean for him as one with extra privileges, with essentially no accountability? How does the US, how does the West, which believes in individual dignity or claims to, deal with that? I look forward to talking about the details of how that works from kind of the guardianship system, which I think not enough folks think about. Yes, women can drive, but men's permission is needed for anything. A former US diplomat said to me recently, you need a benevolent male to do anything in Saudi Arabia. And that's not a way to live. As we've seen again and again, you can't trust males to be benevolent. From the guardianship system to targeting dissidents abroad, and that's not just Jamal Khashoggi, that is people who, as a great report in the New York Times yesterday showed us, receive threatening WhatsApp messages, receive summons to show up to Saudi diplomatic facilities with no knowledge of what will happen when they get there. And I think that's something we can really consider by looking at the Saudi population, considering their needs and what vision of human rights kind of we can offer them and that the new Saudi dispensation has to offer. So with that, I'll let my great panel get started, whatever order you'd like, and then we'll open up for Q&A. We did have another great panelist, Raed Jarrar, an activist who might be well known to some of you, but he had a family emergency. He's not going to be here. So it's us, and we'll do some Q&A. So thanks all. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you. I'm going to take an academic view, and pardon me for doing that. It's just because I want to sort of lay out an analysis. Thank you, Rula, for that very emotional and thoughtful and reflective view. And I think so many of us feel the internal pain that is sort of exuded today. And I think we're all sort of had this dark cloud hanging over us. And it's not just about Jamaat, it's about every individual from the region who is critical thinking. And I want to point out, and I'm going to take this academic analysis because I've been studying Saudi Arabia for decades, And one of the things that I think the Arab Spring taught us, and I know it's a sort of like passé to even mention it, but it's not dead because it's about critical thinking amongst young people. What is critical thinking? And this is something that it's not being a critique, it's not being a critic, it's not being a dissident, it's not being an opponent. I actually wish we wouldn't use those words. Because critical thinking from my classroom, I can tell you, and what we are taught pedagogically as an academic, is to actually make our students ask questions, okay? I'm talking about from the family unit to entire society. I have young children. When you have young children, you know, critical thinking is a pain in the ass. Teach your children to ask why, right? This is what we're teaching our children. Why? Think about it. It's a painful experience as a ruler in my home, okay? Take the analogy further. To have my children constantly ask me questions, but it's a sign of their intelligence. It's a sign of their maturity. It's a sign of their growth as individuals. And that's the problem. The problem is the Arab region, the people are at the phase where they are asking questions. They want to know why. They want to know what's the merits of this particular policy. What's the merits of this particular government action? Again, as a parent, as a ruler, it's so much easier to just say, as my parents taught us, okay, coming from a very typical Middle Eastern society, shut up and just do as you're told. That's the way we were trained to teach, that's the way that we taught our kids, was basically accept it and move forward. The young people of the Arab world today are not putting up with that. And so, for that reason, Jamal Khashoggi is one of many who will keep asking questions. And if you want to understand what a good society is, and a wealthy, creative society is one that asks questions. So here is the challenge. The challenge is, frankly, and we can extrapolate from what's happening in Saudi Arabia to so many other countries in the region, is that their attempt to sort of crush this critical thinking and creative thinking is shooting themselves in the foot for their own long-term health of their societies on every front. So my challenge is, and I'm a political economist, so bear with me here, because unfortunately I think in these terms. The old adage of, the carpenter, sees, or a hammer sees a nail. This is just my thing. And I look at what's happening throughout the region and see a demography and demographic of young people who are, as you pointed out, highly educated. Do you know that the Saudis at one point sent 100,000 plus students to the West under the King Abdullah education program, scholarship program? Many of them I met in some of the most elite universities who are asking questions. They're being taught to ask questions. And it's a good thing for their society. And they're going home. Okay, I had the great pleasure of meeting Lujan, who's now in prison and apparently not well, because she asked questions. And she was one who came to a Canadian university and lived basically an experience of, in my classrooms, this is the thing, as students, we're teaching them, ask the question, we need to have this debate, we need to have this conversation. Don't just do as told by powerful authorities, because then we will just have an army of drones, or if you will, bunch of people who don't think. You can't create a good society unless you have a society that questions things. And so one of the things, for example, that I'm mindful of is, I've been hearing a lot of sort of Tom Friedman's reflections, and him saying that, the China model is going to work for Saudi Arabia, which first of all is very laughable. From a political economist perspective, the China model works, questionable, because it's not really working if you actually had insight into China, but let's just say that it works, is that this authoritarian bargain comes with the fact that you offer 2 billion people who are basically industrial manufacturing. You look at the Saudi Arabia with 30 million people, it will never be, I guarantee. You can put all the Vision 2030 proposals out there, get all the McKinsey consulting firms to write a plan for you. It will never be an industrial manufacturing house. It has to be a service-based economy with 30 million people. A service-based economy, there isn't a single one you can point to today that has an authoritarian streak. Why? Because a service-based economy is one that questions. A service-based economy requires creativity. It requires innovation. It requires the basic creativeness required to ask, wait a minute, how can I make this better? How can I design this better? It is a service-based. It is not putting a peg in a hole, if you will, which is the fundamental difference between an industrial and a service economy. So this is the challenge, is that too much of the Middle East leaders just don't understand fundamental, frankly, economic policy making. And it really breaks my heart, because you have legions of people ready to take on the challenge of being a part of creative and free-thinking society, but they have rulers, as I think Rula pointed out, who don't see their citizens as citizens. They are takers. Okay? This is really interesting. They can take the reforms that's given to them from the top down. They are not allowed to ask for it and question it. Okay? If we look at what's been happening in Saudi Arabia, some of the social and economic policies are fantastic. This is what is so frustrating. What's frustrating about this is that perhaps the vast majority of Saudis today would very much appreciate some of these social and economic reforms. But here is where the autocratic streak comes in, because they are not willing to have this be a contract of you asked and I gave you. That's the citizen relationship. The citizen relationship is I work for you as the government. No. We can't have that in the Arab world. It is I give you when I want to give it to you. Okay? It is that parent, it's that mentality of the parent. Same thing. My child can't ask me why or ask questions of when do I get this. It's basically on my terms and my terms only. Shut up. I give it to you when I want to give it to you. This has to change. And the challenge is the people have already changed. This is what I want, if there's any message that I can give today, is that the Arab people and the Saudi people have already changed. They are at a point where they are no longer going to be the recipients of reforms. They are going to demand it. They're going to think about it. They see it. We live in an interconnected world where it is difficult for any Arab today to be completely blind to the reforms that are happening in the world, the questioning of society in the world today. So this model is just incredibly, it is from a bygone era that will not succeed in the Arab world in the long term. And it is really, frankly, at their loss. It is at their loss. I mean, one of the things that Jamal Khashoggi said that was so, I think, poignant in one of his comments was that I would have been the first to support these reforms. I mean, if you were a ruler like a young crown prince who was taking over a country slowly, why wouldn't you want to have the support of your intellectuals, your actual, the bright minds, the stars of your society, go out there and champion for you? I mean, this is what is so, I think, incredibly frustrating as an academic. But it's because the model of the relationship between the ruler and the citizen is the one of a taker. The citizen is required to only take, never to ask, never to seek, never to question. And it's fundamentally upside down world, because that is not where the Arab people are. And this is something that I think eventually will have to change. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your remarks. So I am hoping to provide, I'm an attorney in private practice, and I'm hoping to provide a bit of the legal perspective and the legal framework. I should, as all good lawyers do, give a bit of a disclaimer. So any views expressed here are my own and not that of my firm, and also anything I say is not intended as legal advice. So again, I'm hoping to give a legal perspective, although we'll try to limit the legalese. So what I want to talk about is what legal resources are available to address some of the human rights concerns that my fellow panelists have raised, and specifically what is Saudi Arabia's obligation under international law, and what the international community can do and is doing to put pressure on Saudi to comply with these obligations. So I think I should start by giving a bit of a broad overview of what is international law. Although I know this is DC, so 50% of you are probably lawyers, but for those of you who are not, so it can be broken up really into two buckets. So there's customary international law, which is essentially a set of norms that we've agreed over time are norms that most countries operate under. And the second bucket is legal obligations arising from conventions and treaties. So these are conventions and treaties that states specifically agree to abide by and commit themselves to. So what is Saudi bound by? Well, of course, all countries are bound by customary international law, but that can be a bit difficult to enforce. So very specifically, Saudi has committed to a number of specific conventions and treaties. So these include the Arab Charter on Human Rights, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, and Degrading Treatment, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So I'd like to just touch on those three and how they relate to the current political situation. So the Arab Charter for Human Rights was created by the Arab League of States, so it's a regional convention, and Saudi ratified this in 2009. And this charter makes a number of guarantees. So it prohibits torture or degrading treatment. It prohibits arbitrary arrest and detention and guarantees a right to a fair trial. And obviously, you know, there's other provisions, but these specific ones are extremely relevant in light of the increasing reports of arbitrary arrest and detention of women, and also the population more broadly. Of course, as the other panelists have touched on, we've seen a rise in arrest of women and a number of other individuals for speaking out against the government. And the number does appear to be on the rise. Human Rights Watch has done an analysis of the numbers that are publicly available from the government, and about a decade ago, the number of individuals detained for over 6 months without a charge was in the hundreds. In the last year or two, that number is in the thousands, as much as 3,000. So certainly you can see that's a drastic rise even by the government's own numbers. So the question is why? Certainly there are political reasons that have been raised by this panel, but legally speaking, one cause of this could be the 2017 anti-terrorism law, which broadened the definition of terrorism to any action that, quote, insults the reputation of the state or, quote, harms the interest of the kingdom. So obviously this is very broad sweeping language to which any number of activities could be swept up into. So the second convention I'd like to speak about is the Convention Against Torture. So this is a UN convention, and the kingdom's been a party for decades, since 1997, and it essentially does what the name says that it does. States commit to enact legislation to prevent torture, to ensure that torture is not admitted as evidence at trial, and commits to investigating allegations of torture. And certainly news reports would suggest that torture is occurring. And additionally, in 2017, access was granted to a UN special rapporteur to investigate allegations of torture, and the special rapporteur was given some limited access to the court system and detention centers, but his report details that his access was extremely limited. But even in spite of that, he found credible allegations that there were incidents of torture, including by electric shock, use of coerced and confessions, and a refusal to investigate allegations of torture by the government or the court system. So again, we can see that these allegations fall very squarely within what Saudi is committed to through the Convention Against Torture. And the final convention I'd like to talk about is CEDAW. That's short for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And that's particularly pertinent to the topic of women's rights, of course, because this is the convention that in which states commit to eliminate discrimination against women through a number of certain acts, including legislation to refrain from discriminating against women, to promote equality, and identifies very specific rights, so voting rights, employment rights, access to health care. There is a big but, though, for this convention, because Saudi has issued a very specific reservation, and states can issue reservations to any number of the articles. And there are multiple to CEDAW, but one of them is that Saudi says it's not bound by any article that contradicts the, quote, norms of Islamic society. And here again, we can see this is extremely broad language, which any number of the articles of the convention could be sort of swept out through that language. So really, it's a commitment to this convention, but it's a sort of a very weak commitment. So we do have these conventions, though, which I think are, among the best, of course, routes to pursue any international law claims. So how do we apply them? Application of international law is always a bit difficult, as there are limited bodies that take these cases and limited mechanisms for enforcement of any of those decisions. So the Arab Charter does not yet have a body, although there's an optional protocol that is in process to create a body. The UN does have a number of bodies which will consider country reports and claims and allegations. CEDAW, in particular, has a committee. But having filed claims before CEDAW before, I will tell you that even a successful decision doesn't necessarily mean that a country then takes that decision to heart, or the highest court will hear an appeal, or that the laws will change. But it is a very helpful advocacy tool. And activists can take that decision and say, look, this country is standing in violation of something it committed to, and that's problematic. So certainly a great tool for advocacy. And then some other options, a bit more in the political sphere of what can the international community do, and what is the international community doing to put pressure on Saudi Arabia. So recently, the EU issued a resolution calling for the UN to examine its members of the Human Rights Council, of which Saudi is a member. And it did not call out Saudi by name. But that council is supposed to uphold the highest values of human rights, and members can be removed for committing gross violations of human rights. And there have been cases where states have been suspended. So Libya was suspended in 2011, so it's not without precedent. So certainly that is something that states are calling for, and individual activists are calling for. There's also domestic actions in states outside of Saudi. So in the US, historically, there's been the Alien Tort Statutes Act, which allows for civil claims relating to human rights abuses abroad. That's become increasingly limited in the past years through a number of new decisions, but other states have similar laws, and certainly those are vehicles for claims related to women's human rights abuses. And finally, the UN report that I mentioned, the report by the Special Rapporteur in 2017, called for a number of very specific actions, and one of those was to provide unfettered access to the UN Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture, to carry out regular and unaccounted inspections of detention centers. And certainly that's a very specific action item that the UN and international community could use to put pressure on Saudi. So these are a few of the international law options and a bit of the framework. Some, of course, have more teeth than others, but I think taken as a whole, all can be used as, at minimum, mechanisms to put pressure on the government, and at maximum, hopefully, effective tools for individuals.
Thanks very much, Mason. I think we often forget that the Saudis are actually committed to international protocols and have signed these things. And one of the things some of the activists who were arrested earlier this year were working on and were talking about was the UN Periodic Review, which is coming up for Saudi in just a few months. So these are these kind of watershed moments that the kingdom would rather you forget about, but they're there. Abdullah, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yes, of course. I will talk about constitutional reforms. So the broad question is, can there be reforms without rights? And to answer this question, we have to know and define what reform is in this context. So just observing how the events go in Saudi Arabia, and how the situation developed in Saudi Arabia, I can tell that the reforms, for example, let's take the social reforms as an example. So MBS attempted to do social reforms by cracking down on the very social reformers that campaigned for decades for the social reforms themselves. And take the example of Loujain al-Hadloul, and other examples of Hutun al-Fasi, Aziz al-Yusuf, and others. And when we talk about religious reforms, he tried to convince people and the Western media that he is doing religious reforms to, fight extremism. But what he did actually, in fact, is attacking the very religious reformers that historically fought extremism and terrorism. He did that by attacking the very moderate voices within the religious discourse. When we talk also about economical reforms, he did that by attacking the very economical reformers within the Saudi society, and take the examples of Barjas al-Barjas, Jamil Farisi, and Isam al-Zamil, who is a very well spoken on economics and economical issues on Saudi Arabia. So these are the reforms that are presented, and that's how the PR try to portray these crackdown like if these were part of the reforms themselves. But if we go to the very idea of constitutional reform, what has changed in the Saudi system? When first the Saudi Arabia, the current Saudi Arabia was established in the 1924, when King Abdulaziz entered the Hijaz region, he said that we're gonna establish like a parliament-like council to let people elect among the elites, not like the public, but among the elites. And we will give you some, not some freedom, we'll give you absolute freedom. That's according to Jalal Kishk in his book, As-Saudiyun al-Hijaz, who interviewed King Abdulaziz at that time, who was the, the founder of the current Saudi Arabia. So these were promises, probably were not fulfilled. These were not applied. The council was established, but time by time, Abdulaziz took some of the powers, and then all the powers, and then he appointed his son Faisal, and then just left that council to be toothless at the end. But at least there were some interaction between the people, the elite. There were promises to change. There were some kind of interaction that gave some hope for the people to have some constitutional real reforms. And by the way, at that time, King Abdulaziz said, we're not gonna have some nomical kind of parliaments. We're gonna have a real parliament that should have voting, election, freedom, and freedom of speech, and etc. So that was King Abdulaziz when he entered Hijaz, and he also promulgated the Al-Ta'limat al-Asasiyya al-Hijaz, which is the basic instruction for the land, like a constitutional-like kind of document. In that constitution-like document, he said there should be freedom of speech, rights should be protected, and things that really look like reform, real constitutional reform. That was in 1924. So when Abdulaziz passed away, there was King Saud. King Saud, in the 1960s, tried also to establish some kind of real constitution at that time. And there was the constitutional movement that at the end produced the Free Princes, that Prince Talal was part of it, a movement that called for real constitutional transformation that would have transformed Saudi Arabia into a constitutional monarchy that should have freedom for speech, also the freedom of assembly, should have election in the parliament, and a parliament that check on the system and on the executive, on real issues like budget, on the budget, on on the power of the executive, that would have transformed Saudi Arabia into a real constitutional monarchy. Well, that was aborted because of King Faisal, who removed King Saud from power, probably because of that, and appointed himself as a king. And King Faisal at that time was a crown prince, if that just rings any bell. So he was a crown prince. He removed King Faisal from power because he wants to have the absolute monarchy that he always probably dreamed of. And then, but to balance that, to give some people some hope, also he said, I did that because I relied on the nation. And if the nation at any point wanted to, just take me out of the picture, I'll be, out of the picture, and you guys should take care of the system. So he said that. Even when he had that absolute monarchy, he tried to portray that like if he depended on the people of Saudi Arabia. So that was Faisal. But when King Khalid came to office, Crown Prince was Fahd at that time, who became a king later. So the Crown Prince said 2 times, one even to the New York Times in the 1984, and the other times in the late 70s, before that years before that, he said, we in Saudi Arabia were going to have a parliament that will be established the next year, but half elected, and then the other half will be elected the following year. So we'll have a full elected parliament that should have power, that should have checks and balances kind of system. We will have kind of separation of powers, if you may call it, but that did not happen because there was no real, change, but at least there were promises to change. There were promises to have a constitutional monarchy. There were promises to have freedom for speech, right? There were promises to have some election. King Fahd in 1992 established the current council of the current consultative council, Majlis al-Shura, and with that he also promulgated the basic law of governance, but that was the parliament. The Shura Council is still powerless. There is no real election. There is nothing. There is no election at all. There is no freedom. But King Fahd at least allowed some interaction. There were 2 memorandum. There were 2 big and popular petitions by elites and popular scholars at that time, demanding some elections, demanding some parliament, demanding some freedom, and demanding some even freedom of assembly. But at least so at least there were some interaction between the two, between the government, as Basma said, it's not a blessing from the king to give you this and that. It should be an interactive, mutual agreement between. It's kind of social contract between the people and the rulers. That would not have happened like in a moment. It has to be through struggles, demands from the people, and then some interaction, and then it will develop through time. But that left some hope. There will be some development, constitutional reform during King Fahd. When King Abdullah came to power, he was a crown prince before that. Before he came to power, he was crown prince when King Fahd was really sick. And King Abdullah allowed some interaction, some of that interaction. It was still a constitutional monarchy and is still, it was still an absolute monarchy and is still an absolute monarchy that has no real freedom, but at least allowed some interaction that would give some hope for people to establish at the end the social contract. Anyway, King Abdullah allowed for these demands to take place in Saudi Arabia. There was a popular petition in 2003 that was called رؤية لحاضر الوطن ومستقبله, a vision to the future of Saudi Arabia and its current situation. And in that petition, they asked and they demanded specifically constitutional monarchy, a transformation to take place in Saudi Arabia. Prince Abdullah, Crown Prince at that time, received the petitioners, these people, in the royal court, and he allowed them to interact. And he said to them literally, your vision is my vision, and your project is my project. He said that literally to them. And several people, reported that. Even one of them, Ali Diminu, who wrote, a book about that movement. Abdullah al-Hamid also reported that, and he is in jail because he is asking for constitutional monarchy and real change in Saudi Arabia. So he said, your vision is my vision. It did not happen. The promise was not fulfilled. At the end, his vision turned to be different than theirs. There was no constitutional reform in Saudi Arabia, but at least that hope, that margin, gave some hope for people to ask for change. But what has changed now is that when King Salman came to power and Crown Prince became Mohammed bin Salman, he was a turning point in all that narrative. He said literally, I am going to be there for the next 50 years. So forget it. There is no real constitutional reform at all. And he said, absolute monarchy is almost the solution. When he was interviewed by the Atlantic, he said he tried to advocate absolute monarchy. So there is now a turning point even in the history of Saudi Arabia. Even in the context of Saudi Arabia, this is just the worst case scenario that any constitutionalist would think of. So that's the change that we have seen. If there is any change, it's a change toward the worst. And I'm not expecting any real change or any constitutional reform in the near future.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. That history, I think, is so valuable because I think we also sort of imagine this is just how it's always been, this is how it should always be, and that's very much a narrative that, ruling regimes like. And with that thought of sort of what's shifted and what's changed, I was hoping we could start off just a bit of discussion with when that happened. And to my mind, and please feel free to disagree, to my mind, that sort of has a lot to do with 2 years, 2003 and 2011. Not 2003, I'm sorry, 2001. 9/11, and then sort of the Arab Spring and what came next. Because it seems to me that a lot of this is couched in what you were referencing, Abdullah, this idea of, if it's not me, if it's not the autocrat, it's the mullah. It's the fear of religion, it's the fear of extremism, and that's used in so many ways to justify any kind of crackdown on dissent, particularly in a dialogue with the West. So I'm wondering if you can comment on how that's been used by the regime now, and whether, and of course there are major problems in terms of extremist ideologies being spread, and certain clerics who are spreading anti-Semitic, anti-Shia, anti-Christian, anti-Western thoughts and ideas, and reports suggest that textbooks continue to have that language, that, as you said, a lot of the most moderate clerics are being locked up and others are being promoted who don't have a track record of moderation. So what's going on with this idea of Mohammed bin Salman and autocracy and the China model will protect us from religious extremism in Saudi Arabia?
So look, the Arab Spring was a watershed moment, and I want to put it very plainly, because for years, the Arab governments peddled the idea that we cannot have political reform, liberalization, any sort of free-thinking society because of external threats. And you the full gamut of it. If you were in the Soviet orbit, during the Cold War, that was America. And if you were in the American orbit, that was the Soviet Union, the Israelis. I mean, you could find always a boogeyman that was external to you. What happened with the Arab Spring was a really watershed moment, because of that idea that they have been peddling for years with state media that kept up this narrative suddenly fell. And the people that went to the squares did not ask about, did not put a sign up saying, America, the bad guy, or why are the Israelis poisoning our water, or all of the sort of, comments that we heard for decades throughout the Middle East, okay? So if there was a water pipe main that broke in Algeria, they had to blame somebody external. I mean, this was a mainstay facet of most, Arab media. The challenge here is people were saying, it's not the fault of some external power. It's that corrupt individual down the street in the prime minister's office that's been siphoning off my wealth, living really grand, and at my expense. So it suddenly brought the questioning internal. And this was a watershed moment for Arab governments, because they were finally put under the microscope and had to account for why is there so much policy failures internally. We cannot keep blaming the outside world. And don't get me wrong, there is plenty of intervention and blame to go around. I am not excusing decades of US foreign policy and the rest of it. But it's important here because people during the Arab Spring were, again, in the if you will, the idealist phase, were not focusing on external actors. And that's important because that was a watershed moment when Arab regime said, oh no, we cannot use the external boogeyman for all of our failures. Right? And this is a part of an educated society. It's a part of a free, regardless or not, like it or not, the media is increasingly internationalized. People are able to see what's happening, the mismanagement in their own backyard. We can put, some of that credit or blame on Al Jazeera. I mean, you can find plenty of evidence that show people started to question, saying, open the books. Open the books. You can't keep telling me we're poor when, I can read on CNN that we got $10 million or 10, whatever from the EU. Where is that money? I mean, this is the point. The point is the focus became internal. Okay? So here's the catch. If you are basically now seeing that, your people are questioning you and you've lost the great old boogeyman, you need a new one. Enter the anti-terrorism laws. It's great because ISIS just so happened to be at the same time. It's very convenient. It's very convenient that all of a sudden we had a new boogeyman. And frankly, the word anti-terrorism just puts a smile on every Western leader's face. Because, that's the misconception they have about the entire region. The entire region is full of crazy Muslims who just want to kill the West. And so anti-terrorism means yeah, you're going to kill 10, and so maybe there's a few that are innocent there, but that's okay. In the end, it's worth it. We get it. I mean, we have to take responsibility in the West that frame of reference is there in the Western mind. And so the challenge is, it just fit perfectly the Western narrative. Bashar al-Assad can talk about terrorism from day one. I mean, the smartest man alive was Bashar al-Assad, despicable human being. But every child that took to the street, every protester was a terrorist from day one. Smart. He never called them opponent. He never called them a dissident. He never called them a critic. He called them terrorists. Beautiful. Who's going to disagree with anti-terrorism?
And
right?
today, Loujain is the terrorist. Of
course she is. I mean, everybody who undermines the beauty of the state. I mean, look at that. You just eloquently put down that statement. I mean, anybody who critiques, says, I want better for my country, that implicitly, if I want to read very sort of, theoretically and poetically, could say that's a critique of the state. I mean, this is what we've gotten to. We've gotten to the point where someone like Jamal Khashoggi, who is seriously not a dissident, who is seriously not asking for anything special. I mean, the man is just basically saying, I want to be able to write freely. Like, it's not saying bring down, I don't think he's ever said bring down the monarchy. He is absolutely a monarchist. But even that, the most, if you will, benign type of critique, to say, I want better, I want a society that I can, freely think in, you just, embarrass the state. Down you go with all the rest of the radicals.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'll speaking of using the banner of terrorism as to justify crackdown, to justify oppression. it's a policy that almost tyrants across the region, do. I'll just point to the idea of fighting extremism in Saudi Arabia. When Mohammed bin Salman said he is going back, I don't think he is now repeating that because he realized it's really dangerous. He said he's returning the Saudi society back to pre-1997, right? 1979, sorry. He is pointing to the very incident of the Mecca besiege by the probably the first terrorist movement in Saudi Arabia in 1979. So he is, with all this stupidity, returning back to the elements that really produced the first terrorist movement in Saudi Arabia. He is returning back to that society, to the same policies, to combining oppression and getting the most extremist voices closer. And I'll just give 2 examples of that. He is trying to claim during the past 1 year and a half that he is curtailing what he called the religious establishment. And let's say, what is the religious establishment and what is that he is curtailing? So there are 2, if we just simplify the religious discourse within Saudi Arabia, and I'm, as a Saudi who was followed the religious discourse since I was born. I was born there, I lived there, I did my bachelor degree there, and I lived like decades there. So it's my society. And I even was raised by one, scholar, Muslim scholars there. So there were, if we simplify the religious discourse there, 2 discourse. There is the moderate voices within the religious establishment that fought extremism and that even spearheaded the campaign against extremism even since 2001 for almost 16 years or something. So these people who even cooperated with the state at that time to fight extremism were put in jail. Right now, while I'm speaking, they are in jail. While the other people, the real extremist voices, are really brought closer. And I'll just give 2 examples. The example of Salih al-Fawzan and Salih al-Haydan. And Salih al-Fawzan was just, if you have seen the picture of the last Eid, the celebration, the Islamic celebration, he was seated in a seat between the king and the crown prince. And if you know it's a really metaphorical, importance to see a scholar seated between the king and the crown prince. He is a bridge. I mean, literally between the prince, the crown prince, and the king. So Salih al-Fawzan, who is Salih al-Fawzan? Just go and look him up and see what his fatwas are. Salih al-Fawzan said oppression against dissidents is not just allowed; it's binding upon the state in order to make society, a Muslim society, peaceful. He said allowing women to drive is not just haram. Allowing women to ride bicycle is forbidden from the Islamic perspective. But that was allowed because there is a thing within his package that the state really likes, which is the fatwa that I just gave. The fatwa that oppressing society, cracking down on dissidents, jailing people is not just allowed, it's binding. It's because they may perform some kind of what he called khuruj on the state. So that's Salih al-Fawzan, and he has other fatwas that are really controversial. He said, for example, Shi'as, Sufis, all sects within the Muslim society are infidels, let alone like what he called infidels, like as the original infidels, because he has like these 2 divisions of infidels. Like the original infidels, like the non-Muslims, and the infidels that are really within the Muslim society, which are sects of Sufis, Shias, and other non-Wahhabi sects. So these are infidels, and infidels in the Salafi context means if you announce somebody and declare her as an infidel, that means that would justify killing and persecuting that person. So that these are the modern voices that MBS embraced. And MBS just like 5 months ago visited him, and that clip, I always point to that clip because it's really important. MBS visited Saleh Al-Fawzan, that person, that mufti, visited his home, and he was the only person that MBS visited at his home. Visited the Saleh Al-Fawzan home, and MBS said literally, "You are like my father." And that was recorded on YouTube if you want to check that out. So that's Saleh Al-Fawzan. The other example that I'm going to quickly point to is Saleh Al-Haidan. Saleh Al-Haidan, I'm just going to bring one fatwa. Saleh Al-Haidan said, probably in 2007 or 8, he said killing the owners of media channels is obligatory upon the state because they bring corruption to Muslim society, and it should be all controlled by the state. So these are the voices of moderate, discourse that MBS is embracing. Saleh Al-Fawzan is received regularly by MBS, and he is seated in a very important seat. And at the same time, MBS is claiming to the West that he is curtailing the religious establishment.
And I would just chime in that although the language of the anti-terrorism law is clearly very broad on its face, this is such a classic paradigm of, do you want security or do you want rights? And we've seen that globally, especially also here in the US post 9/11. So, it's really a Trojan horse in a lot of ways and can really be used to curtail rights in so many scenarios. So certainly, anytime you see that kind of language that's just so general and so sweeping, it certainly raises some red flags.
Kind of a false dichotomy.
That's right. But you need that internal threat to create that kind of state society, that security state. And it links back to your point that, it is not a coincidence that those states which are the most, let's say, worried about Iran have sizable Shia majorities or minorities. And it's not a coincidence. The Shia minority are being used as a fifth column. They are patriots to their own country, they want a good society, and yet they are constantly being painted as paid external activists from some a foreign entity, i.e. Iran.
Who don't belong there and are suddenly,
Absolutely.
again, stripped of citizenship.
Absolutely.
I'd love to open it up to Q&A. I have a million things I want to ask you all, but I want to let you all come in. So if people just want to stand up, introduce themselves, say where you're from, and and please, if you could keep it to very classic Washington, keep it to a question, not a comment. So thanks very much, please.
Hi there, my name is Dusty.
Oh,
Clearly not me.
Walk me through that environment a little bit.
great question. I mean, to me, it's crazy because I think his constituency, talk about the inner elite are shrinking. He's alienated. We saw that the people that he, holed up in this Ritz-Carlton hotel were many of the investors that were frankly on board with his reform policy. They were going to be the investors. They were many ways the interlocutors to the external world. Who is his constituency? It boggles my mind because it's not clear to me. Who is he trying to appease? I feel like his constituency are the consulting firms. I know that sounds really, frankly, ironic and idiotic, sorry. I have a bad cold if you can't tell, the brain's half working. But, I really do feel like he's got this vision in his head that, that McKinsey has sold him. And that's who he's trying to appease. And he really does believe, in my humble opinion, I think he believes that this can only come with an authoritarian turn.
Really?
He really has this, this concept that he thinks he can create China just It's incredible to me. I mean, it's absolutely upside down world because he cannot create China. But the fact that he thinks he can, I mean, look at that, some of that 2030 talks about an industrial manufacturing. Good luck. I mean, I would love, I mean, you know, getting Saudis to come into the service sector is hard enough. Getting them into the industrial sector? I mean, this is the thing that's so, you know, so mind-boggling. It's just frankly, just ridiculous.
And it makes me think, Basma, of a great piece of yours during the Saudi-Canada spat that I read, where you were sort of saying the West is boggled by why would you pick a fight with Canada, right? Like, this is ridiculous, Chrystia Freeland. But really what you said, and I thought that was so on point, is this is for a domestic audience.
Oh, yeah.
This is for, and you were saying an interesting thing about young, educated Saudis who feel a lot more agency, right? And who feel we are ready to take charge, we are ready to be sort of individuals.
Yes.
And
may I say this, because I want to say something that's controversial, and please don't misunderstand me. I do feel he's very popular.
Yes.
And this is something we have to understand. I think that there is 90% of the society, and maybe I'm wrong on that, that really feel like finally somebody's bringing in the change. Finally we have theaters. Finally we have, you know, women can work. I mean, if you look at the social and economic reforms, they're impressive. They really are. And the reality is, look, I mean, we're, you know, as policy nerds, as DC, you know, think tank types, politics is everything to us. But, you know, we all know we have family members of our own blood who are basically, politics, I don't care. Give me everything else. And he's giving them everything else. So, you know, he's giving the 90% that, you know, the vast majority of society actually cares about, and that's good enough for them. And so there is popularity for him. Understand that. Just like we have good family members and our loved ones, you know, who basically don't give a damn about what's happening in Congress. And, you know, it's like, okay, well, what's the price of bread at Walmart? What's the, I mean, that's what they care about, right? Can I go out and watch a movie tonight? Can I go to the theater? This is the stuff that they love. And so he is popular, you know, and that's something that, you know, it's an uncomfortable fact. And yes, agency, they've given them back agency and the feeling that finally things are moving. Because for a long time, and Saudis know this better than anybody, it was like stuck in a time warp, right? You know, I describe Saudi society as, at least the exterior, because things are happening inside, behind people's doors was a totally different world, we know that. But outside, it was literally like stuck in the 1950s. And so finally things are moving. And you know, people are attracted to change makers. They like that. But it comes with an enormous cost. And at the end of the day, it's futile.
And from my understanding, that just comes also with a lot of hyper-nationalism as well, which is kind of filling this void, perhaps, that was previously filled with like religious mandates or loyalty or participation through a more consensus-based system. Suddenly it's, we are the victim, we are going places, we are Saudi Arabia, senators are voting against us, Iran is meddling with us in Yemen, rally around the flag. And that, I think, is a very powerful force that is something MBS understands better than maybe anyone has on the Saudi
Make America great again. It's a slogan, you know, it's now become everywhere. And it sells because people want that. They want change. They want something. It's a false prophet bringing the change, but it's change.
Abdullah, please.
Yeah, if I think about it, it seems like there are two important and different phases during just the past 2.5 years since he became Deputy Crown Prince and Crown Prince. The first phase, when he presented first the Vision 2030, I think almost everybody was on board during that time when he introduced that. He promised reforms. He promised social reforms, women driving, and he promised religious reforms like fighting extremism at the same time, allowing freedom of speech. He promised transparency. He promised really economical change at last. And everybody was looking for that, every Saudi. And he was different because he is young. He's our age. He promised something that we can listen to and understand. So, and he said so many times, like 70% at least, what the Saudis are between, I think, are below 30. So that's a really important thing. I mean, at that time, constituents, almost everybody, almost. You always have somebody who disagree. But the second phase, he started to eliminate, alienate, one segment at a time. So he started with the public figures who have following of millions, on Twitter and elsewhere. Public figures, economists, but at that time people were asking why he chose these people. At least there is something wrong about them. He did not, jail us. He did not put us in prison. There must be something wrong. There must be something wrong with them because he chose them. He did not choose the other people. There must be something that we didn't know about that he knew because he is the state. So that was, and then the second people, the judges and legal, scientists and lawyers. In November, in October 2017, he put in jail like a couple of judges that I personally know, and some of them were friends of mine. They were put in jail, and they, when they were released, like a couple months, they said all the interrogations were about why didn't you take the request of the Attorney General for the harshest sentence for this guy and that guy? Why did you, decide this on that ground, not that ground? So it's an attack on the judiciary. So everybody was associated with the judiciary or has anything to do with it was alienated at that time. And then he attacked the businessman and the princes, and people were very powerful within his own family. So he alienated his own family at that time. So everybody was afraid. What is he? Who is he? Attacking next? At that time, still some people would think, well, he said anti-corruption purge, so people, we know a lot of the family and the businessmen were corrupted, and they were part of this and that deals, and so some people still think there must be something wrong with these people. And then he started to attack people on Twitter. Everybody who wrote a tweet or criticized him in one way or another was attacked. And then, as you know, the feminists and the activists in general, the constitutionalists, as we know, and then every event revealed a new segment of society that was alienated at that time. And if you put in mind, the Shia, the Sufis were already alienated because he started already 2016 reign with the execution of couple of people.
Sheikh Nimr.
Yeah, Sheikh Nimr and others. So now everybody started to change their minds. So I think the constituents are still in question, and the public figures that he referred to in their last interviews, he said if you go, he always said if you go to the statistics and public opinion, you would see a lot of people agreeing with me. He said that a lot of times, but he was referring to the first phase. He was smart enough to understand that in 2016 he is different. He was so much different than he is right now. So he's playing that margin.
If we could maybe, because we have about 15 minutes to go, maybe we could do 2 or 3 questions that folks have and just open it up for discussion. So if there's anyone who has any thoughts, questions, yeah, please. We'll just get a mic to you. Nikita's coming over.
Hi, I'm Caroline Tynan, a PhD candidate from Temple University, and I was wondering if you could speak a little more about this, how this is a reaction in some ways to the Arab Spring, and how this compares and contrasts with the reaction of the period that Abdullah was talking about under Crown Prince Faisal, which was the Arab nationalist period. And for example, comparing how Faisal dealt with the Free Princes movement and how that compares with MBS's approach to the reformists today.
Question. And do we have any others? It's your last chance. Whatever is on your mind, burning questions. We promise we'll try to convey them to Mohammed bin Salman himself. barring that, let's talk about, the Arab nationalist period and how this compares. I think that's fascinating and a really not widely understood period in Saudi history.
I'll just be very quick. I think MBS was smart enough to understand history and to read the past experience of the Free Princess movement. So he did a very smart preventive measure. So that's why he did the anti-corruption purge. He attacked the very powerful princes that could compete with him, and because they could compete with him, they may resort to people as King Saud did when he tried to win over his brother Faisal. So in doing so, he eliminated the dangers before it even started. So a lot of people would ask, well, they did not really pose any real threat at that time when, in November 4th, 2017. But he's smart enough to understand that if people grow more angry, a lot of powerful princes, a lot of powerful princes could, side with the people and try to, change the system from within with less problems and bloodiless, move to make the Saudi society survive by transforming the system into a more constitutional system. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's how I see it.
I mean, one thing I think is kind of part of this conversation is whether or not he's consolidated power is a big part of the broader debate. And there's two sides of this sort of debate. There are those who look at, for example, the arrest of Mut'ab and others, particularly because he was in charge of the National Guard. And that, also obviously some of those that were arrested included the media moguls, and it was all deliberate to consolidate power. I think that's pretty obvious by now. Of the 200 and some, or maybe it was less, that were arrested and shook down. I mean, they weren't the most corrupt. Everybody's corrupt in Saudi Arabia, but they weren't the most corrupt. It was clearly who had influence. And we see this as a pattern, right? You said they start off with social influencers. It's the little fish, and then you make your way up to the big fish, right? So there is this question whether or not he's consolidated power. Then you have others who are pointing out that there is internal chaos inside the House of Saud. There are those who have, I think, been suggesting that there have been several attempted coups d'etats inside. Suggestions by a colleague next door at Brookings suggesting that, he sleeps on a yacht. I mean, there are mixed reports about how much consolidation of power there is. I think he's consolidated power. That's my assessment, despite those sort of very attractive stories of, him being ready to escape on his lovely yacht. I think that he's effectively been able to do it because, again, back to that popularity. I mean, I know this it's hard for us in this room to understand because, again, we're the policy nerds here, but really, in essence, I think he's got a lot of popularity. There are people who are supporting him, who feel that finally they've got a change maker. And so I see that the narrative he's been able to give them, and that's a very powerful and nationalist narrative that people have swallowed. So it's a dangerous combination, but it's working. The one challenge, and again, I'm sorry because I'm not trying to take away from the very important ethical and normative issues on human rights, but again, as a political economist, I can't help but look at the money of this and the economics and the financial consequences of his policies are disastrous. There is effectively capital controls out there in Saudi Arabia because anybody who has money is trying to find their way out. And it's happening from Bitcoins to, buying property abroad. I mean, you cannot have a functioning, healthy, long-term economy when your own people are afraid of investing in the country. Right. This is just sort of like, basics, right? You can't have a society that's going to be wealthy if your own people are not buying the Kool-Aid on investing in your country. And this is the challenge. The challenge is there is a feeling today that I could be next, my wealth could be next, as a business person, as an individual, as an activist, as an intellectual, disastrous for an economy. And we are seeing, there has been plenty of evidence that foreign direct investment is rapidly declining. Saudi Arabia does not have, everybody thinks it's a rich country, but it does not actually have the fiscal space to create all the plans. So there will be a time when, frankly, there's not going to be enough, money to build that lovely theater that the 90% are going to.
And the tactics of the PIF and, moving money around between Aramco, whatever.
The fact that Aramco was put on hold is a great example because it was a loss of faith. As a foreign investor, I don't feel confident in investing in this project. And so that is why it was put on hold. We saw the song and dance that it's put on delay, and SABIC and all the other people who are watching the internal machinations of what's happening in Saudi economic policy. But I can tell you there is a loss of confidence, and it's understandable.
And I'll close out with a final question, and I'd love any remarks from all of you on the idea of going back to has anything changed, and just the West relationship with Saudi Arabia and this domestic agenda and reform. I think there's a real sense of kind of fatalism too, especially, and that was something that the Saudis, of course, wanted to impress upon the world with the Canada spat, the sense of if you even criticize us in the slightest way, it will have no impact. However, public outcry is what got Saad Hariri released. Public outcry has been really dominant in the US Senate around Yemen. And there are folks who are standing up in the West and saying, what you're doing domestically affects us because we are your protection. We are your partner, and we've stood with you and stood up for you for so long.
Yep. Not a single, I mean, as a Canadian, I have to point this out, not a single government came to protect or to defend Canada. Not a single one. We were completely our allies. We had this mild statement from the Brits. That was it. Nobody else came and said, Chrystia Freeland or the Canadians are right. And the wording that she took that was in that tweet are literally from the UNHCR. Literally from the UNHCR. So this is nothing new. Many governments have tweeted similar kinds of things, but they picked a bone with Canada because it's easy. It's easy prey, not much to lose out of it, but it makes it, you picked a fight with Canada. Everybody else, all you nice guys out there, you better just be quiet. And it worked. It worked. Nobody came to defend Canada and say that was the right thing, it was the principal thing. Silence.
So does international outcry, outrage over the domestic situation in Saudi Arabia matter, really, to all of you?
But herein lies the problem. The governments were not willing to go to bat for Canada because Saudi Arabia is the #1 buyer of arms in the world. And as long as that dynamic is there, and you're France with your deals, and you're Germany with your deals, all of these countries, they will not go to bat for Canada. They will wait and delay, and if they can politely ignore and look the other way and nobody notices, they will do that. Jamal Khashoggi is making a bit of noise, right? But I'm sad to say, I've been off Twitter for 2 hours. Nikki Haley, resigned, and I'm afraid that Jamal Khashoggi is going to go, and that's it, it's done. No one's going to pay attention to what's happening. We had a slow 2 news days. Thank God, Trump didn't tweet, because we could have actually focused on this disappeared, journalist. But we may go back to revert to the same unfortunate situation where, what's happening in this town, like squirrels, just going to change people's perspective, and we're not going to focus on this unfortunate fate of this journalist.
Mason, Abdullah, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I just would say to your question of does international outrage make any difference? I think there's another question there too, which is there international outrage? Of course, like you say, people who are policy wonks and are really into this are following this, but I saw an article on BuzzFeed the other day, and it said, top 25 changes in Saudi Arabia for women. So I think there is probably a perception that a lot of positive changes are taking place, and again, of course, some are. Is there an international outcry? I don't know. I think things like the European resolution asking for reevaluation of who's on the UN Human Rights Council, certainly that suggests maybe there is some building, but I think it's actually a bit of an open question in my view.
It's really weird. At the same time that reports talk about Jamal Khashoggi being killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, there are reports are being published about the economical change in Saudi Arabia and reforms and people. And also in July when a lot of social reformists and feminists and activists were put in jail because of their decades-long call for allowing women to drive. They were put in jail because of these calls and these demands. a lot of reports did not talk about that, but rather talk about allowing women to drive and how that was a real change of the Saudi system. At this, I mean, until this moment, to this moment, the guardianship system is still there. And, you know, feminists and activists who are calling for real change are either intimidated, banned from travel, interrogated, put in jail because of these demands. But reports, you know, prefer to talk about something else, about the whole transformative movement of MBS of allowing women to drive. A change that, you know, these women put their lives for. But, you know, that's really sad.
I think there's no better way to sort of close this out than to refocus back to Saudis themselves and to the Saudi we've been talking about again and again because he's missing and can't express it himself. I was reading myself last night, Jamal Khashoggi's words, and I just won't forget, we Saudis deserve better.
Yep.
The end of one of his Washington Post pieces, which I think is so important. So Saudis deserve better. Let's see what the prospects are for reform. Thank you all so much. Thank you, panel.
Thank you.